and I would urge and challenge other pharmacies to do the same.
Vice President Kamala Harris praising the announcement that mifepristone, the first pill in the abortion drug regimen, which starves children to death in utero, will now be sold at CVS and Walgreens. The FDA announced that these massive drug chains could be certified to prescribe mifepristone a little more than a year ago, in January of 2023. CVS and Walgreens have announced a rollout of mifepristone in select locations over the next couple of weeks. About 20 or so independent pharmacies throughout the U.S. have already been certified and are selling mifepristone, according to GenBio Pro, a business that distributes abortion drugs. And the National Abortion Federation, in partnership with Danco Laboratories and Planned Parenthood, have facilitated massive distribution of abortion pills in person and via mail, with a database that lists hundreds of providers across the U.S. Dr. Christina Francis is the CEO of the American Association of Pro-Life OBGYNs. She's a plaintiff in the case before the U.S. Supreme Court, in which the justices will consider whether or not mifepristone should remain on the market. She's joined now by Julie Blake, senior counsel in that case. Ladies, thank you for being here. Christina, let's start with you. Why is this happening now, despite it being permitted by the FDA over a year ago when it comes to these pharmacies?
Well, Prudence, thank you so much for having me on with you today. And, you know, it is certainly very disheartening news that large chains like CVS and Walgreens have now agreed to start dispensing these high-risk drugs. And, you know, I think it is a good question as to why they've decided to do this, because these are not drugs that treat any kind of disease process, at least for this indication of induced abortion. And, you know, really the pharmacy is not the place to be dispensing these drugs. We've all been to our local CVS, our local Walgreens. We know what it's like when people are standing there waiting to pick up prescriptions. This is not a place where anyone can have any kind of privacy. And certainly pharmacists and pharmacies are not qualified to rule out contraindications or reasons why a woman should not receive these drugs, reasons that would make it more dangerous. They can't make sure she doesn't have an ectopic pregnancy or know how far along she is in her pregnancy. And so, you know, the FDA in its reckless actions when it removed essential safeguards governing the use of these drugs, and then again, as you said last year, when they said that local pharmacies could now essentially become abortion facilities, the FDA has set up this situation where women's lives are going to be actively endangered because of not having appropriate safeguards in place around the dispensation of these drugs.
Right. Those are really good points. And Christina, these pharmacy chains, they've really made a point to emphasize that they've gone through all the proper channels to become certified to sell mifepristone so that women will be safe. But who heads up that certification process? What accountability exists there?
Well, you know, from my experience in looking at the process of how people become certified, it's actually not a difficult process to become certified, unfortunately, to prescribe these drugs. But what I think is important, again, for people to understand is that normally when a pharmacy or a pharmacist is dispensing a drug, they're relying on the fact that the person receiving that has an established relationship with a medical professional who is going to be monitoring the use of that drug, who's going to be monitoring for any potential complications.
Yeah.
And we know that that does not exist in this circumstance. You know, whether a woman has gotten online and ordered these drugs and then it's being dispensed through a pharmacy, or whether an abortion provider has given a prescription for this drug and then she's picking it up. We know that the typical circumstance for women obtaining these drugs is that they are not being obtained from a medical professional that she has an established relationship with. And so my question to these pharmacies would be, who's going to be monitoring these women for life-threatening complications?
Right.
Who's going to be managing those life-threatening complications? We know because of the FDA's actions that it's going to be physicians like me seeing these women in emergency rooms when they're experiencing potentially life-threatening complications.
Right. And let's talk a little bit more about those life-threatening complications. What have you seen women experience in terms of physical symptoms of taking these abortion pills alone at home, maybe in their bathroom, their dorm room?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's very definite physical risks. Like hemorrhage or very heavy bleeding, retained tissue where she doesn't pass all of the pregnancy and has retained tissue and maybe needs an emergency surgery to complete that. And infection and sepsis are very significant risks. But there are also risks beyond that, that again, the FDA has set up a situation where women are even more vulnerable to these risks, such as not screening for coercion or seeing, is there someone who's forcing this woman to have this abortion, or screening for trafficking. And as we said before, screening for and ruling out a life-threatening condition like ectopic pregnancy. Is the leading cause of maternal mortality in the first trimester. So these are all things that women deserve to be seen in person, to be evaluted for. Yeah. And that's, of course, not being done because of what the FDA has done. And as you said, that's why we are asking the Supreme Court at the end of this month to put those original safeguards back in place. So at the very least, women can have an in-person evaluation before obtaining these high-risk drugs.
Right, right. And we know that doctors such as yourself have published studies emphasizing all of these risks that are involved in taking abortion pills, but some of those studies have now been retracted from medical journals. Julie, I want to turn to you. How is this going to impact the case before the Supreme Court? We know that these studies were a major part of the reason this case came into existence.
Well, we're confident that whenever the Supreme Court looks at the science, they don't have to go any farther than the FDA's own label, which says that roughly 1 in 25 women who take these abortion drugs will end up in the emergency room.
Yeah. Well, ladies, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time. We'll continue to track this important case.